Having been introduced to the American War of Independence in the last video, I suppose many questions are coming to your mind now. Why were the colonial settlers in America? Why did the British government exercise its rule on America? What were the differences between the colonist governments and the foreign rule? And what led to the resentment among the colonists and the colonizers? To understand this event in history, we have to go back to a time when people did not even think that America as a nation existed. Now let's jog our memory back to the last chapter. We have read about the age of discoveries, or the age of explorations as it was also called. I think you remember that. I think most of you will remember that between the 15th and 17th centuries, major European nations that were good at seafaring or had a good history of sailing and were located close to the seas set out to sail to discover unexplored, unknown lands. Do you think this happened without a reason? Definitely not. The European governments and the royalties also gave full support and funding to the voyagers to explore new lands. But what was the reason behind this? Why were the voyagers sailing miles and miles to explore new lands? The primary reason behind these voyages was to establish trade routes with major African and Asian nations. It is during this age of explorations that we get to the discovery of America. When this age of explorations was at its pinnacle, the Italian sailor called Christopher Columbus, under the patronage of Spanish royalty, discovered the New World in 1492. What was this New World? This New World, as it was discovered then, comprised the two continents of North and South Americas. Do you know that North America is the continent in which is located the present-day nation, the United States of America? But what happened in this New World? These two continents, the North and South America, were brimful of metals. These were also growing cash crops in the likes of sugar, tobacco, and food crops like potatoes. But why were the New World of any importance to the European traders? When the traders realized that these two continents were full of so many resources, they understood the prospect of trade that this New World opened. This is then that huge number of traders from European nations flocked to the New World. But what did the traders do once they reached the New World? Was it very easy for them to settle here? Definitely not. But what did they do instead? These European traders managed to lure these backward indigenous people and extort huge profits by procuring goods from them at dirt cheap prices. What did they also do? While these European traders were gaining wealth and prosperity from trade with this New World, they were also sending those riches back to the European nations. What did this do? This eventually made the European nations very prosperous and affluent. So what prospects did this New World open to the European traders? It meant tremendous expansion in trade and also immense prosperity for their homelands or the European countries. Now what happened after this? The European nations, the rulers of these European nations, were also increasingly supportive of this trade with the New World. Do you know why? It is because that they realized if they get to settle in these lands, they will be able to extort maximum profits, huge resources from the New World. This implied immense economic prosperity for the European nations, and this is the reason why the New World was extremely lucrative for the European countries. By the 17th centuries, most European nations had understood that they need to settle in these lands to be able to exploit it to the fullest extent. What was happening in Europe? At that time, Europe was rife with wars and famines and plagues and so many diseases. It was then that the European nations realized how crucial this New World was to house their ever-growing population and to pursue agriculture. So what was the outcome of this? The European nations realized that they should have permanent settlements in this New World. People were to settle on the new lands. So this was the time that the European nations set out to colonize these new lands or to establish their colonies in the new world. But that brings us to the question, what is a colony? A colony is a piece of land that is under the rule of another country or is controlled by another power. A colony is a distant territory belonging to or is under the control of a nation. But why are colonies created? Powerful nations often set out to bring new lands under its territories or exploit and exercise their powers on relatively weaker regions. Why is a colony important in this context? The age of explorations, as we talked about previously, was followed by a rapid race of colonization of the newly discovered lands. Colonies were primarily set up by the powerful European nations on the newly discovered lands. But what was the reason behind the setting up of colonies? This cannot be without a reason. Colonies were primarily set up by powerful European nations to exploit the resources of a weaker nation, to spread their religion onto new lands, to bring back huge resources from the colonies, and to exercise their power and bring more territories under its control. These are the primary reasons why colonies are established across the world. And in the New World, it were the European nations that were setting up colonies. But that brings us to a new point. Was there only one power who was exercising its rule on the New World? Or were there many nations set out to establish colonies in the New World? Whenever the European nations explored a new continent, it was never just one nation setting out to establish its colonies. Major European nations competed amongst themselves to get hold of a bigger slice of land. Do you know this was also seen in the case of Africa, and it was called the Scramble for Africa. But you must question that which countries set out to establish their colonies in the New World? In the South America, as you can see in this map, the competition existed mainly between Spain and Portugal. So Spain and Portugal were the major powers that were setting up their colonies in South America. But what do we see when we come to North America? In North America, we witness a tussle between Britain, France, and Spain to establish their colonies and get the biggest tract of land in this territorial unit. While Spain got to get hold of the western part of North America, it was Britain that got the most strategic colonial holdings in the eastern part of the continent. But now we should understand what these colonial holdings were and how strategic and how important these were to the British government. While Spain was the first country to set foot on North America and establish its colonies, it was Britain that got to establish its colonies along the Atlantic coast. This territory that you see here, this tract of land that is marked in purple, consists of the first colonies that Britain set up in North America. Do you know what these were called? These were called the Kingdom of New England. Britain set up 13 colonies in North America. Let us now point out and try to remember what these colonies were. The 13 colonies were New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Do you know what was the first British colony that was set up in North America? Jamestown in Virginia was the first British colony established in North America. Now if I quickly ask you, how many colonies did Britain set up in North America, will you be able to answer that? Were there 22 colonies, 13 colonies, 14 colonies, or 30 colonies? Yes, you are right. Britain set up 13 colonies in North America. Now that we saw that the colonies were being set up in the New World or North America more specifically, I suppose many questions are coming to your mind. Who were these colonial settlers? If I ask you to leave your home, your nation, and move to a different country to settle, will you be willing to do that? What were the reasons why these colonial settlers came to the New World? While the European governments supported this mass migration to house its ever-growing population in the New World, another major reason behind this is something different. These colonial settlers were people who faced difficult lives in the countries they belonged to. The colonial settlers mostly came from Ireland, Britain, Scotland, and Germany. But why did they come to the New World? Because they believed that the New World opened for them the prospect of new opportunities and better life. Why were they looking for a better life and newer opportunities? This is because they wanted to evade and escape European politics, religious persecution, turmoil, famines, poverty, warfare, and whatnot. These colonial settlers were people who faced difficult and turbulent lives back in their nations, and they came here with the hope that the New World will give them a better life and better opportunities. As you can see here already, by 1770, more than 2 million people had settled in Britain's 13 North American colonies. We just discussed how Britain set up its 13 colonies in North America. But what happened after that? Whenever any new colonies or any new territorial unit comes into being, the first thing that needs to be taken care of is administration. So how was administration done in these colonies? Who exercised their rule on these colonies? Whose was the final say that governed the lives of the people in these colonies? Let's talk about it. These colonies had representative colonial governments. That is to say, at the colonial level, the people or the colonial settlers got to elect their own representatives, which is why these people could set up their own representative governments. That sounds very fair, right? Because the colonial settlers who were staying there got to elect their own representatives. And these representatives would in turn take care of the needs and requirements of these settlers. But everything isn't as fair as what meets the eye. These colonial governments or these representative colonial governments were in charge of local administration. What does that mean? That means that these governments could exercise their power in administering any trade that was done among the 13 colonies. Whatever power they had was restricted to these 13 colonies. That is to say, their power did not exist beyond these 13 colonies. Since these representative governments performed and functioned at a colonial level, what they did also happened within the local purview. They were also in charge of levying local taxes on these 13 colonies. So, these colonial governments could take care of local taxes, local administration, local trade within the 13 colonies. But this was all the power that was at the disposal of the colonist governments. But who exercised the final power on these colonies? We just talked about how the power they exercised was a very local thing. It was actually the British government that got to exercise sovereign power on these colonies. It sounds very unfair, right? Because the British government that was sitting miles and miles away, oceans and continents away, was getting to exercise the final rule on these colonies. Now, what were the things that the British government regulated? First and foremost, the British government regulated international trade, that is trade between these colonies and other countries in different continents, be that in Europe or Asia or Africa. So international trade was at the disposal of the British government. What else did the British government do? Any and every economic decisions that pertained to the well-being and the development of these colonies were also in the hands of the British government. It took care of all the economic decisions that were enforced on these colonies. Another very important and simultaneously unfair thing that the British government did on the colonies was levying extra taxes. The British government levied huge arbitrary taxes on the people of these colonies. Many taxes were levied on them, and the colonial settlers found these foreign impositions very oppressive. They were having to pay taxes that would go in turn to the British Parliament. So it wasn't in any way beneficial to the colonial settlers. The final and the most important part that rested at the disposal of the British government was the power to politically expand the colonies. That is to say, the British government could colonize further tracts of land or increase these territories by further colonizing tracts in the West. So the major powers that pertained to the colonies were exercised by the British government. The colonial government could do everything within a small setup. It was very local in nature. In contrast to that, what the British government did was of a very larger magnitude. Things happened at an international level. The colonial settlers found this division of power, this sort of an administration, very unfair. But this is not the end to the unfair treatment or the unfair division of power that was in existence in these 13 North American colonies. But the most unfair thing that happened in these colonies was that the colonial settlers had no right to elect their own representatives to the British Parliament. Does it not sound very unfair and unjust to you? Why is it so? Because the British government, as we just discussed, was regulating so many things pertaining to the colonies, be that international trade, making major economic decisions, or even politically expanding the colonies. While at the same time there was no representative from the colonies in the British Parliament. This political arrangement showed to the colonists the inferior or the subordinate position they had with respect to the British Parliament. So it was the British Parliament that was the ultimate and sovereign power on these colonies. This was a major reason behind the resentment that was growing up within the colonists. They found this setup very unfair, and it is for this reason that they slowly moved towards organizing a revolution against the British colonial rule. In the subsequent lesson, we will be talking about few other events that can be considered very crucial behind the outbreak of the American War of Independence. We will also talk about the trajectory that this war took, the shape it took, and how the colonizers and the colonized were involved in fighting. Who emerged victorious? Did victory come very easily to either of the parties? These are some of the things that we should take into account to understand the American War of Independence with greater clarity. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.